Europe in 1212. Children set out on a pilgrimage lasting many months. What is their destination? A monk recorded this incredible event in a chronicle. The children see themselves as chosen ones. They cross the Alps. They have been called to free Jerusalem of the heathens, and they may even have numbered tens of thousands. Rupert, a survivor, tells the monk his story. A movement with carefree beginnings ends in disaster. Unable to cope with the struggle against the elements, their numbers diminish daily. For centuries, the ordeal of these children remained a forgotten chapter of Europe's history, and the question of who was responsible for this fatal mission remained unanswered. The monks' records show that the children were put on ships in Marseille, and that hundreds lost their lives at sea. The survivors, the records continue, were then taken to the slave markets of North Africa. What is the story behind the so-called Children's Crusade, and what do we know about the fate these children suffered? In December of 1230, two men meet in a French monastery. The monk and chronicler Alberic of Trois-Fontaines, and Rupert, one of the few to survive the Children's Crusade to the Holy Land. 20 years after he returned to a Europe plagued by death and disease, Rupert tells his story for the very first time to the astonished monk. Trois-Fontaines decides to record this unprecedented event for posterity. His chronicle becomes a unique documentation of the fate of thousands of children who were impassioned by a mission but were all doomed to fail.
His name was Nicholas, was it not? Your leader. Nicholas, that was his name.
How do you know that?
It was all his fault, wasn't it? He led you astray.
He was only 14 years old himself. I don't wish to talk about it.
Do you really want something like that to happen again?
No.
Then I shall write down what you tell me, so others can read it and learn from it.
But I've forgotten everything.
You lie.
We believed he was a prophet from God.
Who? Nicholas?
You should have heard him speak. His eyes lit up, and his voice rang out like that of an archangel.
Thousands of pilgrims flock to the cathedral daily to pray before the relics of the Magi. The young especially, Rupert among them, are captivated by the stirring words of the preacher.
It was as if the voice of God was speaking to us. "Do not despair," he cried. "I will lead you to the Holy Land. We will need no ships to cross the sea. Christ has appeared to me, and he will part the waves, and we shall reach the holy city on dry land. And you shall want for nothing, because God our Father is with us. I swear to you, my Lord, we believed every word he said."
The Herzog August Library in Wolfenbüttel, northern Germany. Here we find medieval manuscripts recounting the mysterious events in the year 1212. Among them is also Trois-Fontaines's chronicle. One chronicle from Trier states that the children left for Jerusalem under the sign of the cross to come to the aid of the Holy Land. Their parents had locked them in their houses, but they still managed to follow this self-proclaimed Messiah, Nicholas. For the chroniclers, he remains a shadowy, mysterious figure, this Nicholas of Cologne, who was so idolized by Rupert and his friends.
Every day, more and more people came to join Nicholas. They could sense the presence of God, just as we did. We shall liberate Jerusalem. We, the young, the children, the poor and oppressed, shall march to the Holy Land with God's blessing. And we shall be victorious because we are pure of heart. And everyone, every single one of us, really believed him.
They are driven by the idea of going to those places where Jesus Christ lived. They carry with them the conviction that they will free Jerusalem. They have the will to do so, but they want to achieve it solely by means of their faith. They believe in their divine mission.
The Chronicle of Alberic of Troisfontaine. It tells us that at the same time Nicholas and his followers are leaving Cologne, something very similar is happening in France. The place is Croix on the River Loire, 200 kilometers from Paris. A village of farmers and artisans. Here, the shepherd boy Stephen is born. The chroniclers describe him as the child of impoverished parents. Stephen grows up in the village community and has to provide for himself from an early age. Later, as if from nowhere, he will suddenly appear and, just like Nicholas, will bring droves of children and adolescents under his spell. Legend has it that Stephen is friendly and popular. The people of Croix, and above all their children, trust and believe him. Stephen is deeply pious and devout. Sources report of his love of processions, singing, and prayer. And he is a talented preacher, just like Nicholas. He tells his devoted listeners that Jesus appeared to him one night in the fields and gave him the task of liberating the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem together with his young followers. They gathered here, the chapel of Notre-Dame d'Iron, part of a Benedictine monastery. This is where Stephen's children's crusade began. Another church in Croix, Saint-Georges. Stained glass windows depict the march of Stephen and the children, their hopes and their ordeals. They are one of the very few pictorial presentations of the little Crusaders, created centuries after their fatal expedition. In the year 1212, two completely separate movements form. In France, children march from Croix-en-the-Loire to Marseille. In Germany, the route takes them from Cologne across the Alps to Genoa.
It seems rather mysterious, but those involved in the Children's Crusades had information about the numerous routes, the trading routes, the footpaths and pilgrim routes. The many people who used these routes, the artisans, the peasants, the nobles, and even the travelling whores, spoke about them in the inns and taverns in the evenings, and the information was picked up by the children and young people.
The rallying cry, "Onward to Palestine," is quite familiar to children in the year 1212. Jerusalem is a magical word, because this is the age of the Crusades. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of Christianity's most sacred sites. But here, since the 7th century, the crescent has ruled over the cross. In autumn 1095, the greatest propaganda machine of all time is set in motion. Jerusalem must be freed from the infidel. This is the slogan of the century. The greatest mass army the Western world had ever seen began its march to the east. Behind all this was Pope Urban II. His call to arms was answered by Christians from all over Europe. The Pope promises them remission of their sins and eternal life, but also the treasures of the Orient. The journey takes months and many die en route, but the prospects of salvation and rapid wealth spur the knights on to overcoming the greatest hardships. The army of Crusaders reaches Jerusalem in June 1099, and a deadly battle ensues. Siege towers weighing many tons are constructed. The walls of Jerusalem are regarded as impregnable, but they fall apart in the barrage from the catapults. The Saracens were no match for the heavily armed elite troops from Europe, and after a swift battle, Jerusalem falls into the hands of the Crusaders. In a frenzy of bloodlust, the emaciated victors storm Jerusalem, massacring children, women, Jews and Muslims alike, leaving 30,000 people dead. After this conquest, prestige and religious credibility of the Holy Campaign are lost.
The subject of Crusades was an old one, but just as old were the observations of what had really happened there. Robbery, plundering and murder. It was all about possession. That was a perversion that became a legend, and the children knew it. And these children and young people were idealistic and said, "No, that's not the way. We can do it better. We are the renewal of the Crusade spirit." And so when a youthful leader comes along, a movement is born, a movement for children and young people.
The children find the warlike saber rattling of their heavily armed predecessors abhorrent. Their crusade is a silent, highly idealistic enterprise. Rupert and his fellow campaigners are full of illusions.
In July 1212 we set off. There were a few thousand that followed Nicholas and our cross. There were children and adolescents, but also adults, teachers with their charges, old people, even nobles and monks were with us. And everyone prayed for us, also those who stayed at home. Many had left their families, their fathers and mothers, and nothing and no one could stop them leaving.
The manuscripts in the Wolfenbüttel library speak of the children's enthusiasm, even fanaticism. Parents locked them up, but they broke free to join the march, to be able to take part in this divine mission.
This children's crusade is the first authentic example of a genuinely popular crusade. It not only differs fundamentally from the official crusades, but was in fact the complete opposite of what they stood for. These children were steeped in the belief that they were a kind of chosen people. This idea was due to the fact that the powerful had failed, and as the children saw it, the reason for this failure lay in their depraved lifestyles, in the guilt they had burdened upon themselves, and also in their pride and arrogance.
The First Crusade too had once begun as a service to God, but it ended in a barbaric bloodbath. The initial idea of liberating Christianity's holy places becomes a cynical pretext for a ruthless conquest. In the mosques today, there is nothing to show that the Crusaders once erected their barracks here. But as furious as the beginnings to Christian rule were, its duration was brief. It was not even to last a century. In late summer 1187, Sultan Saladin stands before the gates of the Holy City at the head of one of the most fearsome armies of the time. The legendary general finally succeeds in storming the walls of the city in that autumn. The final battle. Those believing themselves safe under the protection of God were soon robbed of this delusion. This time, it was the Crusaders under their heavy armor who were helpless against the Saracens' agility. Their battle techniques are outdated. Many Crusaders are lethargic, the victims of years of gluttony, and they are outnumbered. Jerusalem falls. The triumphantly celebrated crusade is a miserable failure. Many thousands lose their lives in the divine mission. They perish wretchedly, and very few succeed in returning to Europe alive.
He too believed he had heard the call of God. One of my brothers. Now he lies here rotting, fallen in the Holy Land.
And why did the mighty knights not succeed in freeing Jerusalem from the infidel?
I know not. It was not the Lord's will.
At the end of the great scheme to liberate the holy places lies the humiliation of defeat. Jerusalem is once again in the hands of the Muslims. The children are convinced they know the reasons why the enterprise failed. The armed Crusaders had left the path God had intended. With this in mind, they now put forward their own idea. Dominance and possessions are not what they want. This sets a completely new tone, putting purity of faith before power and material values.
Poverty, rags and childish innocence were the insignia, the symbols of the new change for the better. This was helped by religious orders which in similar fashion were trying to say, church pomp is wrong, and all the greed for power is wrong. We have to start afresh. And as children, they could put this across in an especially credible manner, because as children, on top of everything else, they were young.
I could tell you who assisted you and why. But I do not believe you would understand anyway.
As you wish. There were monks who came to Nicholas. They were not like the ones we had known until then. Not so...
Not so fat? You can continue speaking. I am not one who sees heresy in every word.
They preached so beautifully that ownership is a sin, and that Jesus had owned nothing, not even a roof over his head, and that we should show the church what it really means to follow Jesus.
At the beginning of the 13th century, various movements arise propagating voluntary poverty as the essentially Christian ideal. For them, a Christian life means abstention, renouncing possessions and consumption. Their asceticism is the living opposition to the luxury of church dignitaries. They believe it's the only way Christians can return to genuine piety. Historians are now certain that this asceticism movement at least influenced the Children's Crusades, or even took them over completely.
And now this asceticism movement suddenly discovers the crusade idea and appropriates it. And then a tract appears, but not from among the Children's Crusaders themselves, but from within the circles of this asceticism movement, calling for the recapture of Jerusalem, listing precisely these criteria: that the church-backed crusades of nobles have failed, and that now, in any attempts to recapture the holy city, Christ would only bestow victory on the poor. And that now seems to me to be precisely the vocabulary the Children's Crusade puts into practice.
There was a girl. Her name was Marie. She was no older than 11 and had stolen a pear, a single stringy pear. He was so big and strong, and she was so small. He seized her, threw her to the ground, and then...
The treatment of children in the 13th century is strict and unrelenting. That makes adolescents like the young Rupert very receptive to the promise of happiness and freedom.
And once your Nicholas had accepted his calling as a prophet of the Lord, he spoke with the tongue of angels, but in such a way that all could now understand him. And more children followed him as a herd of sheep follows their shepherd. That's how it was with the French boy, Stephen. Did your parents approve of your staying with this Nicholas?
Of them, they were just happy to have one less mouth to feed. It is not pleasant, my lord, to be born the son of a soap boiler. Not a day without hunger, and not a day without beatings.
In the 13th century, children are small adults, with all the duties of a hard working day. To step out of line means punishment. Children are hungry mouths that have to work for their food. So, in the ears of such poor wretches, exhausted from their work in the fields and regularly beaten by adults, what must the prospect of a land where milk and honey flow have sounded like? The chroniclers report of their willingness to cut all ties and leave their homes and families behind them for attempting new life.
The overall situation of children and people in the 12th and 13th centuries was characterized by rapid population growth, resulting in increasing numbers of children and young people. Their social prospects, however, were very limited. Childhood was not like it is today. It meant work, hardship, and hunger. And in this situation, despite the religious fascination, there were of course enormous social pressures too. All this together was a powerful driving force.
It was so hot, like a furnace. Nothing to eat, nothing to drink. The river had dried up.
Lynch law is commonplace, even for stealing food, for it was a time of famine. The year 1212 begins with a wet winter, followed by a dry spring and a hot summer. Bad harvests are the consequence. The children have to rely on charity. The people in the towns and villages have nothing to eat themselves and are suddenly faced with throngs of hungry children and adolescents. For the local people, they must have seemed like a plague of locusts. Most were already weak and undernourished when they set off. Their hunger is now accompanied by the exertions of the march, the heat, infections, and disease. It is an expedition without knowledge or logistics. The daily struggle for food alone would have been enough to sap the children's physical and psychological energy almost completely.
Boiled nettles and a few acorns was all we could find. She was too weak to even go a single step further. She was going to die. I was mad with desperation, but she was not afraid. It was as if she had had a vision. She saw the heavenly Jerusalem, the holy city. Just as it says in the Bible, and the building of the wall of it was of jasper, and the city was pure gold.
Early death was an everyday occurrence in the Middle Ages. Science has proved many romantic conceptions of the Middle Ages to be false. Anyone reaching adulthood is lucky. Old age is a rarity. Vienna, the Natural History Museum. Each of these skulls represents a very personal fate. The museum houses one of the world's largest collections of human bones. The mortal remains of people from all ages are stored here. Men, women, and children. The impressive museum has over 60,000 skeletons, equivalent to the population of a small town. These skulls are a mine of information. It's astonishing how much modern pathology can glean from one single specimen. Together with Vienna scientists, we want to construct an individual fate. From among these exhibits, we choose the skeleton of a medieval teenager who lived and died in the same town. This is what a participant in the Children's Crusade might have looked like. An individual case, but nonetheless representative for an entire generation.